Laughter does not always sound the same. Sometimes it is warm and spontaneous, the kind that spills out of people who are genuinely happy, who are sharing something real, who are alive in the best possible sense. But sometimes laughter is a weapon, cold, deliberate, aimed. And on that particular Thursday evening in late October, the laughter that swept through the polished dining room of Celeste, one of the most celebrated restaurants in the city, was unmistakably the second kind. It started at a corner table, a ripple of snickering that spread across white linen and crystal glasses. And it was aimed at a woman who had done nothing more than walk through the front door. She stood just inside the entrance, cheeks flushed from the cold outside air, raindrops still glistening in her dark hair, her eyes moving quickly around the room with the expression of someone who had already begun to regret the decision to come. She was wearing a burgundy wrap dress, her coat folded over one arm, a small clutch bag held against her side. She was, by any reasonable measure, a woman who had made an effort for a special occasion, but the group of four at the center table, 2 men and 2 women, all expensively dressed, all several drinks into the evening, looked at her and saw only something to mock. At a corner table near the window, a man in a worn canvas jacket set down his fork very slowly and looked up from his meal. He did not say anything yet. He simply watched, and within 15 minutes, the owner of the restaurant came running across the floor to bow before him, and the words that man spoke, in a quiet, even voice, would leave every person in that room standing in stunned silence. As of tonight, this place belongs to me. Ethan Brooks was 38 years old, and he had spent the better part of a decade making himself invisible. Not in the way of a man who lacked confidence or presence, he had both in quiet abundance, but in the way of a man who had learned, through loss and hard experience, that the people who broadcast their power tend to be the ones most afraid of losing it. He drove a 10-year-old truck. He wore work boots and canvas jackets. His hands were calloused in the way of someone who had once worked with them and had never stopped wanting to feel like that person. On that October evening, he had come from a meeting that had run 4 hours longer than expected. A negotiation involving 3 legal teams, 2 investment groups, and an acquisition he had been quietly maneuvering toward for the better part of 8 months. He was tired in the particular way that comes not from physical labor, but from sustained mental endurance, the kind of tired that sits behind the eyes. He had driven past the restaurant twice before stopping, because what he wanted was not a reservation at the city's most photographed dining room, but simply a warm meal and an hour of quiet. He had been to Celeste once before, 2 years earlier, for a business dinner he had not wanted to attend. He remembered the food being excellent and the atmosphere being exactly the kind of self-congratulatory that made him deeply uncomfortable. But the rain had started coming down harder, and his usual diner was closed for renovations, and he was too tired to keep driving. He parked, walked in, and was shown to a corner table with a view of both the entrance and the main dining room. He ordered the salmon. He ordered a glass of still water, and he began to do the thing he had always done in public spaces. He watched people. It was not voyeurism or judgment. It was something closer to genuine curiosity, the habit of a man who had grown up with very little and had always understood that the texture of human behavior was more instructive than any business book ever written. He watched a couple at the far table negotiate some invisible tension with forced smiles. He watched a table of colleagues perform the choreography of corporate dinners. He watched the waitstaff move through the room, the way some of them carried genuine warmth in their posture, and some of them carried the glazed efficiency of people who had long ago stopped seeing the individuals they were serving. He was halfway through his salmon when the front door opened, and he saw her standing on the threshold, caught between going in and going back out into the rain. Emma Carter had been awake since 5:30 that morning. She had spent an hour making sure her 7th-grade students had everything they needed for the collaborative mural project that had taken 3 weeks to plan. She had fielded a passive-aggressive email from a parent who objected to the colors her class had chosen for the hallway display. Apparently purple and gold were not appropriate, though the parent had not elaborated on why. She had eaten lunch standing up in the supply closet because the staff room had been taken over by a curriculum planning session she did not have the bandwidth to sit through. She had driven home, changed out of paint-stained clothes, spent 20 minutes trying to zip a dress that fit 6 months ago and still fit now, though it required more architecture than she preferred to think about, and she had looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment. Today was her 35th birthday. She had made a reservation at Celeste not because she was trying to impress anyone, she was going alone, which she was perfectly comfortable with, but because she had been walking past this restaurant for 2 years and always told herself she would go someday, when she had something worth celebrating. And this year, for the first time in a long time, she was celebrating something real. She had been approved for her own classroom art program, a proposal she had written and revised, and submitted 4 times before it was finally accepted. She had survived 3 years of a medication that had altered her metabolism in ways that still frustrated her, and she was working with a new doctor, and she was eating well, and she was, slowly and imperfectly, finding her way back to herself. That was worth something. That was worth a good meal and a glass of wine at a table by the window. She had made the reservation 2 weeks ago, selected a table by the window, and she had looked forward to it every day since. She had even called her sister that morning, her older sister Rachel, who lived in Portland and had been saying for 2 years that Emma needed to stop shrinking herself and start claiming the life she actually wanted, who had said, "You deserve it, Em, just go and enjoy yourself." And Emma had decided she agreed. She had stood in front of her bathroom mirror for a moment after hanging up and looked at herself, not with the critical cataloging that had been her habit for 3 years, but just looked, the way she tried to teach her students to look at a subject before they put pencil to paper, with openness rather than judgment. And she had thought, you are 35 years old, and you teach children how to see beauty in things, and it is your birthday, and you have earned a good dinner. She pushed open the door of Celeste at 7:15 and stepped inside, and within 30 seconds she understood, from the spreading laughter and the unsubtle stares, that the evening was not going to go the way she had planned. The cruelty was not dramatic in the way that cruelty is sometimes portrayed, not one single venomous remark delivered with theatrical precision. It was worse than that. It was casual. It was the kind of cruelty that is performed for an audience of friends, that seeks confirmation and applause, that treats a human being as an occasion for entertainment. The group at the center table, led by a man in a pale gray suit, whose confidence came entirely from the fact that he was surrounded by people who laughed at everything he said, made no effort to lower their voices. The comments came in fragments. Observations about the width of the doorframe, a joke about structural engineering, a question directed at the table about whether the kitchen would have portions large enough. The 2 women in the group contributed their own commentary, delivered with the particular viciousness of people who have been taught that cruelty dressed in laughter is not cruelty at all. A host had appeared at Emma's side and was walking her toward the table she had reserved, and Emma was doing what she had learned to do over years of this. She was holding her face very still, her expression neutral, her chin slightly lifted, every muscle in her body channeled into the simple project of not showing how much it hurt. She was good at it. She had had a great deal of practice. The host, a young woman who looked mortified and also terrified, seated Emma at her table by the window and disappeared. A waiter appeared and handed Emma a menu. Emma opened it and looked at the words without reading them, because her eyes were blurring slightly and she needed a moment to reset. At the corner table, the man in the canvas jacket watched all of this with an expression that was very still and very attentive. The manager, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s named Douglas, was standing near the entrance to the kitchen. He had heard what was happening. He had glanced at the center table, recognized the group they came in every few weeks, ran large tabs, tipped generously when they were in the mood, and he had made the quiet calculation that more people in the industry make than most would care to admit. He looked away. The minutes that followed were slow in the way that only public humiliation makes time move, each second extended and strange, the air in the room somehow both loud and suffocating. Emma had ordered a glass of wine. She was reading the menu with deliberate focus, the way you read a document when you are trying to look occupied rather than wounded. The group at the center table had not stopped. One of the men produced a phone and appeared to be recording something, tilting the screen toward the man in the gray suit, who leaned in and said something that made both of them laugh harder than before. The other leaned over and said, loudly enough to be heard at several surrounding tables, they should have a weighing station at the door, service fee by the pound. The laughter that followed was larger than before, because now a few people at adjacent tables had been swept into it, not from malice, but from the social gravity of a moment that has gained momentum. The way certain kinds of wrongness metastasize when no one names them. Emma set down her menu. She reached for her wine glass. Her hand was steady. She brought the glass to her lips and took a careful sip. At the corner table, Ethan Brooks had stopped eating entirely. He was watching the manager, who was still standing near the kitchen entrance, still looking away. He was watching the waiter who had served Emma, who had found a great deal of interest in the beverage station across the room. He was watching the group at the center table, cataloging them with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything. He had not moved. People who did not know Ethan sometimes mistook his stillness for passivity. People who did know him understood that his stillness was where his decisions lived, that the longer he was quiet, the more certain it was that something was being decided. He picked up his water glass and drank slowly. He set it down. He looked at Emma, who was looking at her menu, whose eyes were wet at the edges in a way she was clearly fighting very hard not to allow. He made a decision. It had to be said that Ethan Brooks had built everything he owned by paying attention to things other people chose not to see. He had grown up in a working-class neighborhood on the east side of Columbus, Ohio. The son of a mechanic and a school cafeteria worker, in a house where the furnace broke every other winter, and they ate dinner at a fold-out table because there was no room for a proper one. His parents were not unhappy people. They were practical and warm, and entirely without pretension, but they were people to whom certain rooms in the world were permanently closed, and Ethan had understood this from a very young age, with the particular clarity that children develop when they are paying attention to things adults would prefer they did not notice. He had put himself through college on scholarship and part-time work, had taken a job in logistics after graduating, and had spent 7 years learning how companies move the supply chains and inventory cycles, and the invisible choreography of labor that most people only ever saw the finished product of before he understood, with sudden and complete certainty, that the interesting thing was not how companies moved but why some of them stopped. Why a business that had functioned for 20 years could collapse in 2. Why the difference between a company that lasted and one that didn't was almost never in the product or the market, and almost always in the people and the decisions and the culture that had grown up around those decisions like sediment, invisibly, over years. His first investment had been $50,000, most of what he had into a regional distribution company, whose owner was retiring and whose employees were worried. He had bought it, kept every employee, restructured the contracts, and sold it 3 years later for just under $1 million. After that, he had done it again, and a dozen more times in various sectors over the following decade, always quietly, always without the apparatus of public visibility that most people at his level of wealth considered mandatory. He did not want to be known. He wanted to understand things. These were, in his view, quite different ambitions, and most people confused them. The only person who had ever fully grasped the distinction was Claire, and after Claire died, the quality of being understood had felt so scarce that he had largely stopped expecting it. He had built a life around his daughter and his work, and the occasional evening in an unremarkable corner table, watching the texture of the world move past. He was, on the whole, content, but he was also, if he was honest with himself, in the way he tried always to be, a man who had put something away and was not entirely sure it was still there. He made a decision. He came to her table the way he did most things, without announcement, without performance. He simply appeared beside it. And when Emma looked up with a startled and slightly defensive expression, he gestured to the empty seat across from her and said, "I hope this isn't presumptuous. I was eating alone too, and I thought you might prefer company." Emma looked at him. He was wearing a canvas work jacket over a plain, dark sweater. His face was weathered in a way that suggested outdoor time rather than neglect. He was smiling, but it was not the smile of a man running a line. It was the smile of someone who was genuinely a little uncertain and was trying to be honest about it. Emma said, carefully, "I don't want to impose on your evening." He said, "You're not." She said, "You really don't need to." And he said, quietly, "I know I don't need to. I'd like to." There was a pause. Something in his directness was disarming. It did not feel like pity, and it did not feel like an angle. Emma looked at him for another moment and then said, "All right." He pulled out the chair and sat down, and he asked her if the salmon was worth ordering, and she said she hadn't ordered yet. and he said that the salmon was very good, and somehow, without quite understanding the mechanism of it, they were having a conversation. It started with food, and moved to the neighborhood, and moved to what they each did for work. And when Emma said she was an art teacher, he asked questions that were not the questions people usually asked. Not vague, polite inquiries, but specific ones, about what age group she taught, and what medium she personally worked in, and whether teaching had changed the way she thought about making things herself. Emma found herself answering honestly, and then more than honestly, and then she was talking about the mural project, and the curriculum approval, and the parent email about the purple paint, and he laughed at the parent email in a way that was both sympathetic and genuinely amused, and the sensation of being listened to was so unfamiliar in this setting, in this city, in these clothes, on this birthday, that Emma had to stop herself from acknowledging it out loud. She noticed, with some surprise, that she had stopped thinking about the group at the center table. They were halfway through their meal when it happened. The man in the pale gray suit, who had been watching their table with the particular interest of someone who has found his entertainment redirected, stood up and walked past their table on his way to the bar, or claimed to be on his way to the bar, and miscalculated the space between tables badly enough that his nearly full glass of Bordeaux upended itself directly onto Emma's lap. The way he did it was plausible enough that it could, theoretically, have been an accident. But his expression in the half-second, before he arranged it into apologetic surprise, told a different story. The wine soaked through the fabric of Emma's dress in a dark bloom of deep red. She pushed back from the table and stood up, reaching for her napkin, her face completely controlled in a way that took enormous effort. The man said, "Oh, I'm so sorry," in a tone that suggested he was not. And then the manager materialized at Emma's side and said, in a lowered voice, that perhaps they might be more comfortable if Emma moved to a different table, one of the smaller tables near the back, as her current location was causing some inconvenience for the other diners. Emma stared at him. He met her gaze with the polished neutrality of a man who has delivered uncomfortable messages before and has trained himself not to register the damage they cause. At the table across from her, Ethan Brooks set down his fork. He wiped his mouth with his napkin. He folded the napkin and placed it beside his plate with the careful movements of a man who is choosing, very deliberately, what to do next. He looked at the manager and asked, in a voice that was quiet and clear, and entirely without inflection, "Who is the owner of this restaurant?" Douglas, the manager, turned to look at Ethan with an expression that started as polite confusion and curdled slightly into the reflexive condescension that some people in service management reserve for customers who do not look the part. He took in the canvas jacket, the work boots visible below the table, the absence of anything that signaled wealth in the legible ways Douglas had been trained to recognize. "I'm not sure that's relevant to your evening, sir," he said, with careful emphasis on the last word. Ethan looked at him steadily. "I'd like to know who the owner is," he repeated. Douglas said, "The owner doesn't typically take inquiries of this nature from," he paused, choosing his words, "individual guests." There was a beat of silence. Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out his phone. He found a number in his contacts and pressed call. He held the phone to his ear and waited through 2 rings, and when someone answered, he said 3 words, "I agree. Tonight." Then he ended the call and set the phone on the table, screen down. He looked at Douglas and said, "Thank you." Douglas blinked. Emma was still standing beside the table, blotting the wine from her dress with a linen napkin, her expression controlled and closed, trying to make sense of what she had just witnessed. Ethan said to her, quietly, "Please sit down. Give it 15 minutes. She looked at him, and something in his face, not smugness, not the performance of someone who is about to stage a scene for an audience, but something steady and certain and entirely matter-of-fact made her sit. The 15 minutes were almost exactly what he had promised. At the 12-minute mark, the front door of Celeste opened and 4 people entered. 2 men in suits carrying leather briefcases, a woman in a sharp blazer with a tablet in her hand, and behind them, a heavy-set man in his 60s named Gerald Crane, who had founded and operated the Celeste Restaurant Group 5 locations across the city, a catering division, and a hotel partnership that had been in the works for 3 years. Gerald Crane walked through the dining room of his flagship restaurant with the expression of a man who is arriving somewhere important and knows it. and he walked directly to the corner table where a man in a canvas jacket was sitting across from a woman in a wine-stained dress. He extended his hand to Ethan and said, "Mr. Brooks, I'm sorry I couldn't be here earlier. The papers are in order?" Ethan shook his hand. "They are." Gerald Crane turned to his team and nodded, and the woman with the tablet tapped something. And that was the moment that small, efficient gesture in an expensive dining room on a rainy Thursday evening that represented the completion of 8 months of negotiation, legal review, due diligence, and the quiet accumulation of the kind of leverage that never announces itself until it is already done. Ethan Brooks had been working toward the acquisition of the Celeste Restaurant Group since February. The deal had been signed electronically at 4:52 that afternoon, during his long meeting, pending only his verbal confirmation. The phone call he had made 12 minutes ago, those 3 words, "I agree," tonight had been his confirmation. The restaurant in which he was sitting, and 4 others like it across the city, now belonged to him. The man in the gray suit had stopped talking. His companions were looking at each other with expressions that moved through confusion and toward something far more uncomfortable. Douglas, the manager, stood very still near the kitchen entrance, the color leaving his face by visible degrees. Ethan did not stand up from the table. He did not make a speech. He spoke to Gerald Crane for several minutes, quietly, while the lawyers attended to whatever lawyers attend to when large transactions conclude, and Gerald Crane, who was a practical man and understood that the ground had shifted, listened and nodded and said the appropriate things. Then Ethan turned to Douglas. He did not raise his voice. The dining room had grown very quiet, the way rooms do when everyone has stopped pretending not to listen. He said, clearly and without heat. "Starting tonight, under new management, any member of staff who witnesses a guest being humiliated and does nothing about it will be dismissed. That is the first policy." Douglas opened his mouth. "The second," Ethan continued, "is that any guest who deliberately harasses another guest will be asked to leave and will not be welcomed back." He looked at the table in the center of the room, the gray suit, the laughter that had started all of this, and said, "Please ask those 4 guests to settle their bill and leave." He said it the way you say something that has already been decided. Not as a performance, not as a punishment narrated aloud for effect. It was simply what was going to happen. And everyone in the room understood that. A waiter moved toward the center table. The man in the gray suit said something under his breath and stood up and put on his jacket with the stiff movements of someone who is very angry and trying not to show it, because the audience has shifted, and his audience now knows that he is the one who looks small. His companions followed. They paid their bill at the door, and the front door opened and closed behind them, and the room exhaled. And in the middle of all of it, Emma sat with wine-dark fabric drying against her legs and her hands folded in her lap and her eyes very bright. And she did not cry right away. She held on for another full minute, but when she finally did, it was not the shaky, mortified crying of someone who feels pitied. It was the particular release of a person who has been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time and has just, unexpectedly, been told they can put it down. After Gerald Crane and his team had gone, the transition logistics could be handled in the morning. There were offices and accountants and general managers for that. And after Douglas had collected his things from the back office and left without a word, the dining room slowly returned to something like its normal register. The remaining guests, chastened or illuminated, depending on their own private accounting of the evening, finished their meals and paid their bills and left in quieter ones and twos than usual. The kitchen staff, who had absorbed the whole sequence of events through the pass-through and the porthole windows of the swinging door, moved through the rest of the service with a slightly different quality of attention, carefully, as though they had been reminded that what they were doing mattered. By 9:30, the restaurant had closed, and the waitstaff were putting the room back in order, and Ethan and Emma were still at the corner table, because neither of them had suggested leaving, and a young server named Marcus, who had the good instincts of someone who would eventually manage his own place, had quietly brought them coffee and then made himself invisible. Emma had borrowed a cardigan from a staff member. A large, soft gray one she had wrapped around herself. And she was warming her hands around her coffee cup, and she said, "You didn't have to do any of that." Ethan said, "I know," she said. I've been told my whole life to just ignore it, he said. How well has that worked? She looked up at him and laughed once, shortly, not entirely humorlessly, and said, Not especially. He said, I didn't think so. The conversation that followed was the kind that happens very rarely, the kind where two people tell each other true things without the usual buffering, because something has already happened that stripped the social veneer down to the wood, and there is no particular reason to perform normalcy anymore. Emma told him things she did not usually tell people on first meetings, or second, or fifth. She told him about the hormone disorder that had been diagnosed 3 years ago, a slow thyroid condition complicated by a medication interaction that had added 30 pounds in 8 months despite no change in her habits, and the experience of watching her body change in ways that were outside her control, while the world responded to the change as though it represented a moral failing. She told him about the fiancé who had ended their engagement with a conversation that included the phrase, I'm just not as attracted to you as I used to be, and the way she had thanked him for his honesty, because by that point, her sense of what she deserved had been so comprehensively revised downward that she had been grateful for any attention at all. She told him about the small cruelties that accumulated over time, not dramatic confrontations, but the constant low-level hum of comments and looks, and the way certain colleagues spoke to her differently, and the way she had started arranging her life to minimize exposure. Taking the less visible seat, arriving to events late enough to slip in without drawing attention, declining dinner invitations, skipping the birthday party and the reunion, and the work gathering all the quiet surrenders that added up to a life that was getting smaller and smaller, without her fully noticing the process. She said, Tonight was supposed to be different. I made myself come. I told myself I deserved a good dinner on my birthday. Ethan said, It is your birthday? She said yes. He was quiet for a moment, and then said, Happy birthday, Emma, and said it with enough directness and simplicity that it sounded not like something you say because you are supposed to, but like something you actually mean. Ethan told her about his wife, Claire, who had died of an aggressive form of lymphoma 6 years ago, when their daughter Lily was 4. He told it without dwelling in it, not because it was not still painful, but because he had made peace, imperfectly and incompletely but genuinely, with the fact that people you love die, and that the question of how to live after that is one that does not have a clean answer. He said that after Claire died, he had spent about a year not making very good decisions, and then 2 years making careful ones, and somewhere in the process he had arrived at a version of himself he found fairly acceptable. He said, The thing about grief is that it reorganizes your priorities without asking permission. I stopped caring about a lot of things that I had cared about a great deal. What I wore, what kind of car I drove, what table I sat at. He looked around the room briefly. What other people were going to think of me? Emma said, That sounds like freedom. He said, It felt like it, eventually. At first, it just felt like loss. He told her about Lily, who was 10 now, and deeply opinionated about breakfast foods, chapter books, and the specific injustice of bedtime on weekends. He pulled out his phone and showed Emma a picture. A girl with her father's serious dark eyes and an enormous grin, standing in what appeared to be a very ambitious pillow fort, holding a chapter book above her head like a trophy. Emma laughed genuinely, openly, fully for the first time that evening. She said, She looks like a person who knows exactly what she wants. He said, She absolutely does. It's mostly wonderful and occasionally terrifying. The coffee grew cold. They ordered another round. Marcus brought it without being asked and left again quickly, understanding, with the intuition good hospitality people develop, that the best thing he could do was nothing at all. The weeks that followed were not a romance in the conventional sense, not a sequence of dinners and declarations and dramatic gestures. They were something more interesting and more durable. A friendship that deepened in the way that friendships between people who have both sustained real losses tend to deepen, slowly and with increasing trust and the particular ease of two people who have decided, for their own separate reasons, to stop pretending to be other than what they are. They had coffee twice, and went to a museum where Emma knew the exhibits well enough to be a genuinely illuminating guide, and Ethan paid attention in a way that made her realize how rarely she had been paid that kind of attention. He introduced her to Lily carefully and without pressure, on a Sunday afternoon at a park where there was no expectation and therefore no performance, and Lily decided within 20 minutes that Emma was, provisionally, acceptable, which Ethan told her later was extremely high praise. Emma watched the two of them together, the way he listened to Lily with the same focused attention he turned on everything. The way he let her finish every sentence, the way he laughed at her jokes with genuine amusement rather than paternal performance, and something she had long ago decided was not available to her began, quietly and without announcement, to rearrange itself. The transformation of the Celeste Restaurant Group took most of the following 3 months. Ethan hired a new operations manager, a woman named Patricia, who had spent 15 years in the hospitality industry and had very strong opinions about how people ought to be treated, and a new executive chef who cared as much about the experience of being in the room as about the food coming out of the kitchen. He commissioned a complete revision of the training program for front-of-house staff, built around a single guiding principle. Every person who walks through the door deserves to feel welcome. He added to the policy something he asked the legal team to build into the management agreements, a formal code of guest conduct that made explicit what most restaurants leave implied: that harassment of other guests, in any form, was grounds for permanent removal, and that staff members who witnessed it and failed to act would be considered complicit. The restaurants were temporarily closed for staff retraining, and when they reopened, they carried a quality of atmosphere that was difficult to articulate precisely, but that multiple reviewers commented on independently, a genuine sense of welcome, as though the people working there actually meant it. Emma had been part of the process from the beginning, first as a sounding board, then as something more formal. Ethan had asked her, somewhat haltingly, whether she would consider taking on a creative direction role for the group's brand identity and guest experience. She had said she was an art teacher, not a marketing person. He had said he was aware of that. She had said she had no idea how to run a corporate brand initiative. He had said she had a very clear sense of what dignity looked like and what it did not, and that this was considerably rarer and more valuable than knowing the terminology. She said she would think about it. She thought about it for 4 days and called him on a Thursday evening and said yes. What Emma brought to the work was not what she had expected to bring. She had assumed her contribution would be aesthetic, a color palette, a typeface, an arrangement of imagery that communicated something specific and true about the values they were trying to build the brand around. And she did those things, and she did them well, drawing on 15 years of teaching people how to look at things carefully and how to make things that said something on purpose. But what she discovered, over the weeks of meetings and site visits and conversations with staff across all 5 locations, was that the more fundamental work was something different. It was listening. It was the accumulated practice of a woman who had been on the receiving end of enough dismissal and condescension and casual unkindness to have developed a very precise ear for the difference between a space that welcomes and a space that tolerates. She walked through each restaurant the way she walked through a new classroom on the first day of school, not looking at the furniture or the fixtures but watching how the people in it moved, where they looked when someone entered, what happened in the 2 seconds between a guest arriving and a staff member making eye contact. She wrote everything down in a small notebook she kept in her bag, the same kind she used for her own sketches. And what she wrote was mostly questions. Why does the host stand here instead of there? Why does the lighting in this corner make it feel like an afterthought? Why do the servers in this location move differently than the ones in the downtown branch, more warily, as though they are expecting to be reprimanded? The answers to those questions, when she started asking them openly in the staff sessions that Patricia organized, turned out to be the real curriculum. She said she would think about it. She thought about it for 4 days, and called him on a Thursday evening and said yes. The campaign Emma designed over the following months was not what the industry expected. It was not aspirational in the conventional sense, no images of perfect plates photographed under perfect light. No studied casualness of beautiful people enjoying beautiful food in beautiful spaces. Instead, it was quiet and specific. She commissioned a series of portraits, photographs of real people, restaurant regulars and staff and first-time guests, shot with simple lighting and no styling, and the images ran with a single line that changed with each one. A different kind of restaurant, full stop. The implication was left to the viewer. What different meant was evident in the photographs themselves, in the range of bodies and ages and expressions, in the sense of ease that all of them carried. The campaign was noticed, discussed, and reproduced in the publications that shape how an industry thinks about itself. People came to the restaurant, in many cases, specifically because of what they had heard about the policy, about the ownership change, about the story of the woman on the Thursday evening in October. Emma had not intended to be part of the story, but the story had legs of its own, and at a certain point she decided that if it was going to be told, she might as well have some input into how. She gave 2 interviews, carefully and with Ethan's support, and said clearly that what had happened to her was ordinary, that it happened every day in 100 restaurants and 100 other public spaces, to people who went home and said nothing because there was nobody to say it to, and that the extraordinary thing was not any one dramatic act, but the accumulated effect of a culture that either permits cruelty or refuses to. What she did not say in those interviews, because it was hers and she was not ready to share it publicly, was what the year had cost her in other ways, the reopening of things she had thought were sealed, the conversations with her therapist about self-worth and visibility, and what it meant to step forward, instead of sideways, the nights when the attention from the press and the industry felt more like exposure than recognition, and she had to work hard to remember why she had agreed to any of it. She called her sister more. She went back to making things for herself. Not for the campaign, small paintings and drawings she kept in her apartment. Not for any audience. Just for the practice of making something that was hers. She started teaching an evening class for adults on the side, a low-key figure drawing course at a community center that met on Tuesday nights and drew an unlikely mix of retired teachers and college students, and a man in his 70s named Bernard, who had never held a paintbrush until his wife suggested it the previous Christmas, and who had, in Emma's private assessment, more natural instinct for line than most people she had ever taught. She kept going. That was the thing about the year that she tried to explain in the second interview, less successfully than she would have liked. That healing was not a moment, or a decision, or a single evening in a restaurant where someone did the right thing. It was a practice, a daily, imperfect, sometimes tedious practice of choosing, over and over, to take up the space that was available to you. 1 year from the evening it had all begun. The Celeste Restaurant Group held an anniversary event at the flagship location on a Thursday evening in late October. The invitations had gone out 6 weeks earlier to staff past and present, to the nonprofit partners Emma had brought in, to the handful of journalists who had covered the story with enough care to earn the invitation, and to a small number of regular guests who had, in one way or another, become part of what the restaurants had been trying to build. Lily had been allowed to stay up late for the occasion, and she sat at a table near the back with Patricia's youngest daughter. The 2 of them engaged in some project involving a paper napkin and a pen that Ethan chose not to investigate too closely. The city had that particular quality it gets in autumn. The air sharp and clean after rain, the light arriving at long angles through the tall windows. The dining room was full in the best possible sense, not overcrowded, not performative, but occupied by people who were genuinely there, who had wanted to come. Ethan gave the opening remarks, which were brief. He said that the restaurant group had spent the last year trying to build something that deserved to exist, a place that treated every person who came through the door as fully human, without qualification. He said, almost as an afterthought, though the people who knew him understood it was not an afterthought at all. I didn't buy this restaurant because of a woman. I bought it because the logic of the thing was right. Nobody should have to pay to be humiliated. There was applause, and he sat down, and he did not seem to particularly notice it. Emma stood up after him and spoke for longer, because she had things to say, and had spent a long time learning to say them out loud. She talked about what it meant to exist in a body that the world had opinions about. She talked about the small erosions, the social withdrawal, the self-revision, the long practice of taking up less space and what it cost over time. She talked about the birthday dinner she had made herself attend, and the dress she had put on, and the decision to walk through a door she had almost walked past, and what had happened after that. She said, "What changed for me was that someone treated me as though I was worth defending. Not because I'd earned it in some particular way, just because I was there, and I was a person, and that was supposed to be enough." She paused. I had forgotten that was supposed to be enough. After the event, after the guests had gone, and the waitstaff were putting the room in order, and Marcus, now the front-of-house manager, a promotion that had come with a salary, that made him briefly speechless and then very quickly practical about his rent situation was doing his careful closing walkthrough, checking each table with the focused attention he brought to everything he considered worth doing well. Ethan and Emma put on their coats and went outside. Lily had been taken home an hour earlier by Ethan's neighbor Mrs. Pacheco, who had known him since, just after Claire died, and who regarded the whole Emma situation with the barely contained approval of someone who has been patient for a very long time and is finally being vindicated. The rain had come back, the same soft October rain that had been falling a year ago when all of it began. They walked for a while without particular destination, along the block and then around the corner where the street was quieter. The warm lights of the restaurant behind them. Ethan reached for her hand, and Emma let him take it, and they walked for a while without speaking, which was one of the things she had come to understand about him, that silence was not absence with Ethan, it was presence, and he filled it differently than most people, with a quality of attention that made the quiet feel inhabited rather than empty. He said, eventually, without preamble or build-up, the way he said everything he meant. The first time I saw you, you were standing in the doorway, and you looked like someone who was deciding whether to stay. Emma considered that. I almost didn't, she said. Come in. I know, he said. I'm glad you did. She looked at him. You changed my life, she said. That's not nothing. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, you were already the person you are. I just held the door open a little longer. She thought about that, about the version of herself who had nearly turned around and gone home. And the version who had walked in anyway, and all the ways in which who you become is partly your own work, and partly the accumulated effect of the doors that are held open, and the doors that are shut in your face, and the rare and extraordinary thing it is to encounter someone who holds a door simply because it is the right thing to do, without tallying the cost, without expecting anything in return. The rain came down lightly around them. Behind them, the lights of Celeste glowed warm and steady through the tall front windows. And somewhere inside, a busboy was stacking chairs with a rhythm that carried faintly through the glass. On the street, a cab passed and threw a sheet of light along the wet pavement and was gone. And a couple walking their dog crossed at the far intersection, and the city went on doing the things cities do, which is to continue in all its indifferent momentum, not pausing for the small private moments that turn out, in retrospect, to be the ones that mattered most. Emma tightened her hand around Ethan's. He did not say anything more. Neither did she. Around them, the neighborhood had settled into the particular quiet of a Thursday night, late in the week. The restaurants closing. The last buses running. The windows of apartments lit in amber and blue above the wet street. On a night very much like this one, Emma Carter had stood outside a restaurant door and almost walked away. She had been cold and tired, and had spent the better part of 3 years making herself smaller in every room she entered. And the warm light through the glass had looked like something that belonged to other people. She had walked in anyway. She was not sure, even now, whether that had been courage or stubbornness, or simply the fact that she had already paid for the reservation. It did not matter. Some decisions matter not because of what they are, but because of what comes after them. And what had come after that one was a year that had changed her in ways that were difficult to inventory and impossible to fully articulate, and a man standing beside her in the rain who understood, without her having to explain it, that some things are better held in silence. Some things do not require narration. The rain continued, and the lights stayed on, and they walked together into the kind of quiet that is not emptiness but fullness, the fullness of two people who have found, through loss and difficulty, and one very particular Thursday evening in October, that kindness is not a small thing. It is, in fact, the largest thing there is. The thing that cannot restore what is gone, but can, given time and patience and the willingness to hold a door open just a moment longer than anyone else would, change entirely the way a person understands what they are worth.